Welcome into the Otson Audibles podcast. I'm Matt Preem, Eric Scopel on the show. As always, welcome to your Friday. The end of the work week is here, and we're going to devote a lot of this podcast about the comings and goings of Oregon's men's and women's basketball programs. You've asked for it. There's been some transfers. There's a lot of recruiting interest. The men's side, they need to make a hire on the assistant coaching staff. There's a lot to do with not Mario Cristobal. He's got a lot of work to do right now, but Dana Altman, head coach of the men, Kelly Graves of the women. If you've been under a rock the last couple of days, there's been some departures from both teams. From the men's side, former four-star top 100 recruit and rising junior Chandler Lawson, a forward, top 100 recruit, former four-star point guard, rising sophomore Jalen Terry. They both have transferred out of the program. Eric and I will discuss kind of the impacts of that. Four-star incoming freshman Jonathan Lawson, Chandler's younger brother. He is asked to be out of his national letter of intent that he signed in November or October this past year. Oregon has granted that, and he is now looking for a new home. So the Oregon Ducks on the men's side, they've got 3 departures to go with their graduating seniors. We'll get to the women, but they've also had 2 transfers. Rising senior guard Taylor Chavez and rising junior guard Jazz Shelley, in about a span of 45 minutes, each entered the NCAA transfer portal, opening up 2 scholarships for Kelly Graves and the women. But Eric, let's start with the men here. I'm not necessarily shocked at all that Chandler Lawson chose to transfer out of the Oregon program. You look at his production down the stretch of games for Oregon, and it was no offense to him, it was minimal. I mean he played a couple minutes against USC, didn't score, had 2 rebounds. He played 12 minutes, had 2 points against Iowa in the second round of the NCAA tournament, and Oregon's loss to Oregon State in the Pac-12 semifinals. That tournament, he played 10 minutes and got 3 points. One of his best games of his sophomore season was 15 minutes and 10 points and 3 rebounds against Arizona State in the quarterfinals. But this was a guy that originally was off the bench, moved into the starting lineup, then came off the bench again. And I just don't think his progression is where we were kind of expecting it. And so while you would have loved to have him back because he was a good teammate, he was a good person on and off the court. He knew the system and what Oregon was expecting. At the same time, the production that you've gotten from him the last 2 years, you can, I don't want to be cruel, but you can kind of easily replace hitting the transfer portal from a 1-year time and then give yourself a little bit more time to find a high school or a junior college replacement in the 2022 class.
Yeah, and I think part of me thinks, and again, I like the upside of what Chandler Lawson provides. I like the length on defense. I mean, I can't remember I don't know exactly how long his arms are, but it looks like they could be like mid 7 foot. I mean, just extremely long, athletic guy. Provides some rim production, but probably not as much as you'd like, given that fact that he's got such good length. Maybe not the quickest athlete off the floor, but like I love some of that stuff he provided. At the same time, part of me thinks you look at the way the 2021-22 roster should be comprised, and I go, I don't know where his minutes exactly were going to come from, and if anything, they might detract from time that 5-star freshman Nathan Biddle gets.
Yep.
From moments that Frank Kepnong gets. And I think, if you were polling diehard Oregon basketball fans, I think a lot of them would say, even at the end of this past season, they would have liked to have seen some of Chandler Lawson's moments, minutes on the court go to Frank Kepnong based upon the way Kepnong played in a limited role. And obviously Dana Altman kind of owned up to it against USC. He probably should have played Frank more.
Yeah.
That's not even to say he played Chandler Lawson too much, but I do think you could kind of look through some of the game logs and the minutes per game and go, well, if you would have shuffled 4 to 6 of Chandler's minutes over to Frank, or if you eliminated Chandler from the equation altogether and those minutes went to Frank, how different would some of, maybe not some of the games have gone, but how different would some of the production, the perspective with Kepnong have been? So you think about that, and then you've of course got a couple other big time bigs in Dante, who comes back healthy, we think, hopefully by the time the season starts after the tearing his ACL, and then Isaac Johnson off the mission, Matt. And I just think you look at that and go, this is not the same Oregon team that we saw in 2020-21, where you were reliant upon a bunch of kind of undersized forwards, and Lawson for a large part of the season, or portions of it, was really your biggest player that you played in the rotation. He would have, next year's team is much bigger, has a lot more talent in the front court. And I kind of go, sure, it would have been great to have the experience of Chandler Lawson, because you still would have been the most veteran of these guys. It is kind of a young group collectively. Like, they played probably 1.5 combined seasons of college basketball. Then probably played like half a season last year, half a season this year, kept on half a season this year. The other guys are freshmen. The experience might have helped, but at the same time, I look at it and go, and I don't know if you agree or not, Matt, but like, those minutes may be better off going to a couple of these guys next year who provide a little bit more rim protection, rebounding, in some instances, I think, a little better offense too.
I do. And I will say this, like, I think we are also viewing, and from the women's side as well, in all sports really, we are viewing the 2020-2021 season, whether it's football in 2020 or basketball in both years. We're viewing this through a lens of a normal offseason, a normal training regimen, and it's far from that. And I think Chandler Lawson was probably the one player on Oregon's team from the men's side that was impacted the most, because he shows up the previous year as a freshman and gets a little bit of development, but it's you take your biggest jump between your freshman and your sophomore years typically. And his period for his big jump, he could not train with Oregon's basketball coaches like any other year that they do in May, June, July, August, and then they really kind of ramp up practice in late September. And so I do want to give him that. And I'm not trying to use that as an excuse, but that does need to be acknowledged.
That's fair. That's fair.
That his development, I think, was the most impacted by COVID-19 and Oregon and the rest of the Pac-12 not having the ability to train their players during those months because of COVID-19. That being said, this might come off as cold, but I also don't think, Eric, he was tough enough and strong enough down low. Like that was an issue for Oregon when he would come in. Is there would be, whether it's being able to secure a rebound or being able to finish off a dump off pass or an alley-oop for a dunk or a layup. Too often he went up against a bigger guy or someone similar in stature, and he would lose that battle. And it was Oregon needs some, they need to be more firm. They need to be more physical. They need to be more tough down there. And they weren't getting that from Lawson. I think that's kind of where Dana Altman's comment of, I needed to play Frank more stems from, is he was giving you that physical, ability and that toughness down low and that rim protection. And yeah, he was making far more mistakes than Chandler was in terms of defensive rotations or offensive rotations. But nonetheless, the toughness that he would have brought, or the physical play that he brought, kind of superseded all of the mistakes that he was making too at the same time. So I look at this and think it's a loss, but I look at it and think Oregon can go out and they can find a transfer portal guy and be fine. And quite honestly, as cruel as it may sound, they probably could get an upgrade at that position. From a Jalen Terry perspective, this one caught me pretty off guard. And I imagine it probably caught Dana Altman, who will be speaking with the media later on Friday, pretty off guard as well. But at the same time, I kind of understand where Jalen Terry is coming from in his decision to transfer out of the program and into the portal. And that's because look at all the guard history at Oregon, and primarily point guard, whether that's Will Richardson the last couple of years, whether that's Peyton Pritchard before that, Casey Benson, and then Joe Young. You find guys, and Altman's point guards, they typically play 35, 32 at the minimum, and oftentimes 40 minutes a game. And that's what we saw play out with Richardson down the stretch. Once he got healthy and kind of got into his conditioning groove, he played in 16 games for Oregon. Only one of those games was below 31 minutes. 10 of those games was 35 or more minutes. And I think he closed out the year playing like 3 or 4 straight games with 40 minutes. And so if you're Jalen Terry, you probably thought, hey, when I'm signing with Oregon, Will's probably going pro the next year. I will show up. I'll get 1 year under his study, and then I will get 2 or 3 years running the show myself as the point guard. And when I say 2, it's probably because I'm thinking I'm leaving as a junior to go pro. And because, look, the reality is we can argue if that's a legitimate possibility or not another time. All these high-level guys, that's their expectation. They view college as a 2 or a 3-year deal if you're not a 5-star recruit, because they have the confidence in themselves, and I don't blame them that they're going to get to the NBA. And so Terry probably looked at Oregon thinking, I got 1 year under Will, and then I've either got 2 years running the show myself, and then I'm off to the NBA after my junior year just like him, or I go 3 years running the show, and then I'm off to the NBA as a senior. Richardson's injury kind of impacts things, and from his draft perspective, and now he's coming back for his senior year, and Terry's looking at it like, well, now I've got a second year where I'm probably going to be playing 5-10 minutes a game, and the coach that recruited me, Tony Stubblefield, he's no longer at Oregon. He's the head coach at DePaul, and I've got to wait another year again to get my job. And at that point, I might not have a leg up on the newcomer that comes in at point guard because I don't have as much, playing experience as I was counting on. And so I get where he's coming from. Like the transfer, I wasn't expecting it, but when you map out, like he was probably looking at, again, 10 minutes a game. I kind of understand it. He wants to play.
Yeah, this one, I'm with you, Matt. I was not. You look at possible names that could leave the programs, and I'll include the women's players, and we'll talk about that later. Like Chandler Lawson leaving didn't take me off guard. Neither of the women's players really took me off guard. This one did a little bit, just because I thought he was really impressive at times when he got extended run, and I felt like you look at what Oregon loses in the backcourt, and he might not be starting next season, but and you said 5-10 minutes. I kind of thought he had the opportunity for more, just because they don't. I mean, I know they're going to hit the transfer portal. Maybe that was what some of the conversations were. I'm sure, and in a second we should probably talk about this too. Just the impacts of Tony Stubblefield, of him leaving, how that impacts maybe both the Lawsons and Terry, because I'm sure that was somewhat impactful. I think those are all recruits he kind of headlined the recruitment for. But I just looked at Terry and thought, like, Aaron Estrada's back. They're going to take some grad transfers probably. Will Richardson's back. Eric Williams is back, but they don't like play the same position. I kind of went like, well, he'll have an opportunity to be a pretty sizable factor in the backcourt next year. Is he going to start? Maybe not. Is he going to be, is he going to average 6 to 8 points a game? Maybe not. And I'm guessing that probably isn't exactly what he was expecting this would look like. And clearly the expectations are one thing for these players, and you're seeing it all across the country. I think it needs to be said. I know Matt's done a good job on social media of outlining it. I've done a good job of outlining with the women's players. There are going to be transfers every offseason, the way this is set up. Even if everybody, even if it doesn't quote unquote make sense in the fans' minds for why these players are leaving, it's just going to happen. It's the nature of the beast. And a kid coming from Detroit who only played, 10 minutes a game this last season doesn't think he's going to play a whole lot more, and just saw his I almost said position coach like it's football, but kind of. I mean, like the coach who kind of was a key in getting him out here is gone now. You add all those things up. it does make sense. I do think it I don't want to say like hurts the program, but now you do have to find a point guard either in the transfer portal this year or next, or find a prep point guard in 21, or more than likely, I think probably 2022. So it does sort of alter, I think, some of the recruiting in terms of that now becomes a need, because you know, in the past you thought, hey, you've got Will Richardson, he's probably going to leave, like Matt said. Okay, he doesn't leave, but hey, you know, and even if he did leave, you went, hey, well, at least you have Jalen Terry's here.
Right.
That's no longer the case. I think that changes things a little bit. I do think, Matt, like, how much of this do you think really was like Tony Stubblefield takes the DePaul job? 3 of the guys who he was pretty key in adding and landing at Oregon all leave. Like, do you think that plays a big role, or is that just too simple and too perfect to kind of identify as the reason?
I'm sure it played a factor. And, you know, I don't think there was any tampering going on prior to departure or after. But I also think there's a good chance that all 3 of these guys end up at DePaul.
Yeah.
Like, it kind of makes sense to me. You know, Terry's from Michigan and DePaul's in Chicago. And, you know, it's just a very quick flight, you know, across the lakes to get there. Or you could possibly drive to get there as well, and do it in a timely manner. So, and then, you know, Memphis to Chicago is also a quick flight, and, you know, maybe half a day's drive or so. So I would think that's possible. Did Tony leaving, like, was it the nail in the coffin? Probably not. I think the playing time, you know, like Lawson's kind of, I think Chandler Lawson, it was like, you nailed it. Like, he probably was going to see his minutes, diminish because of the emergence of Frank Kapnog, the return of N'Faly Dante, the additions of Ryan Biddle, a 5-star guy. And then, you know, they're also getting Isaac Johnson into the rotation again. And, you know, a 7-footer that was a top 100 recruit a couple of years ago that's been, you know, on a mission and now joining the team. So I look at this and think, like, Tony Stubblefield probably, you know, his departure was probably a factor, but it wasn't the factor. Terry's departure, though, long term is one that probably stings the most, because this was the guy, like you said, they were kind of grooming him to be the replacement for Richardson. And so now you look at this and you think, okay, you've got to go and find a new point guard now. And, you know, thankfully for Oregon, they've got some options. You know, Memphis, you know, has a transfer, Boogie Ellis. This is a guy that Oregon tried really hard to pair with Richardson when he was coming out of the 2019 recruiting class. And, you know, the hope is, hey, Boogie would be the backup to both Peyton and Will during last year's run, to, you know, when they won the first of 2 straight regular season championships. He would be kind of the backup to both those guys. And then this year he would have moved into the starting lineup when Peyton graduated, and Will would have run point, but they both would have shared the job, and Chris would have stayed at that small forward spot. That was kind of like their idea when they were recruiting Boogie out of high school, top 50, top 100 caliber recruit. He's now leaving Memphis, so I think that's a guy that they look at and try and see if there's any interest there. I do think you also have to look at Devin Askew, a guy from Kentucky, was a 5-star recruit and reclassified from 2021, which would have been a high school senior this year, same class as Jonathan Lawson. But he reclassified to 2020, enrolled into Kentucky this season early, played, I think, all 26 games for the Wildcats, started 20 of them, had decent numbers on a bad Kentucky team. He is now in the portal wanting to, you know, probably come home. And I think that's another guy Oregon offered. They were involved early before he reclassified to this year, and Oregon obviously didn't have the room for him. And so now you look at that and think, you know, maybe that could be, you know, one of those 2 guys could be your replacement. It's going to be interesting to see what they do. I mean, guard was already a primary, you know, target area. I thought, like, you look at the roster, Eric, we've talked about this off the air with the women a lot of, You can't have too many players. And so
Yeah.
I looked at this thinking like, they probably could take two before Terry left, but ideally you probably want to just find one really good guard, throw him into the mix with Richardson, with at the time Jalen Terry, Aaron Estrada, and Eric Williams, and you've now got one more guy, so you've got five guys for three spots. That's kind of a perfect complement. Jonathan Lawson's kind of like that sixth wing for you. Perfect setup right there from a roster standpoint. But now Chandler's gone. Now Jalen Terry's gone. Now, Jonathan Lawson's gone. And so now it looks like I think you probably need to get two. Like one's probably not enough from a roster standpoint of, if you went Richardson, transfer Eric Williams, and then Aaron Estrada being your backup at all the other spots, that just doesn't feel like enough. Like you probably need another transfer, and you've gone now from having to sign one guard to probably two.
Yeah, and so like Matt, what would you prioritize as sort of strengths for these additions? Is it as simple as you want to get a primary ball handler and then maybe a primary shot maker? Because I think those are the two things. You lose a primary ball handler in Terry. You needed to find a primary kind of shot maker when you lose Duarte and you lose LJ Figueroa, we think, and you lose. I know Eugene didn't play guard in theory, but he was a big time shot maker. I figured that's kind of the primary attributes you're looking for. Any other specific kind of, I guess, things you want out of those positions? They probably
need a shot maker.
Yeah, right.
Like you need a guy that, a la Duarte last year, where like Oregon could say, "Here's the ball. We need a bucket. We don't care if it's a layup. We don't care if it's a mid range or a pull up three. We need something." And that was like, I think that was probably the biggest growth from him from his junior year to his senior year, was like at some point in this past season, something clicked and you were like, I don't care what's going on, who's on Duarte. I feel confident he's going to get a bucket in some capacity. And so I think you need a bucket getter, a guy that can just score on his own, whether it's on the catch or off the dribble or on a drive. You need a scorer. And ideally, you need this guy to be a good outside shooter too. I think secondly, the next part of it is you need a guy that can defend. It helps that Richardson can guard shooting guards and point guards, also small forwards because he's 6'5", and it helps that Eric Williams can basically guard any position on the floor. Right. So you've got some versatility. So you don't need to go out and be like, hey, we can't get a guy that's 6'2". Like we need someone that's tall. Like you can go out and get that smaller guard. So that helps, but this guy needs to defend. And I think ideally it's in that 6'3" to the 6'6" range where he can guard points and shooting guards. I think it kind of limits what you can do defensively if you go shorter than 6 foot, 6'1", just because of sheer size advantage. And then I think the third requirement, and this is where the second player comes in, is you need a ball handler. You need someone that can, if Richardson gets hurt again, or if Richardson gets into foul trouble, or he's having a bad game, you can put another guard in and know that you've got a secondary primary ball handler for this team. I think that's kind of what you need. Ideally, that point guard can also shoot threes. Like I would prioritize, if it was me, guys that can shoot threes and defend, and then ball handling. And if you can find guys that fit those three parts of the criteria, everything else after that is kind of, I think, cherry on the top.
When you look at, like, I guess maybe this is just like a broad strokes question with next year's team. Does it feel as simple as to say that how different is this team going to be stylistically, I guess? Because we talked a little bit about the strengths in the front court, how that's different. We talked about, frankly, right now, and I think it's going to change. They're going to add players, but some question marks in the backcourt. Like, do you think this team is going to be Like, is there a team in recent memory that you think this team could be similar to? Like, is this as simple as being like maybe it's closer to like a Jordan Bell, Chris Boucher team where they've got the two dominant bigs, and Oregon certainly has some options there, and then a bunch of shot makers? Is it like that, or is this kind of a unique situation? And I ask that in part because I'm like, if they are to start, like and maybe this is the way to tie into it. Like, how do you see the starting lineup play out in the front court? Because I look at it and go like, you could start Nate Biddle and he can stretch the court as a power forward, or you could go with a double big with both Frank and N'Faly Dante. And that right there is two guys who really don't stretch the court offensively from a shooting perspective, but boy, scoring them on defense would be just very, very challenging. Like, I know it's way out, but like when you're looking at this, like how do you kind of figure out the power forward center tandem there? Because I think there's suddenly you go from a spot where it was like you're starting 6'6", 6'7" guys, and now you've got 3 to 4, 6'10" to 7 foot guys who all provide different things.
I think right now, if Fallman didn't add any transfers into this, the starting lineup right now is Dante, Frank Kepnog, Eric Williams, Aaron Estrada, and Will Richardson. And that's in part because that's kind of basically who's left on the roster. But I think when you look at the roster and the additions that they might add, I still expect Frank and Dante to be your starting center and power forwards. I think Biddle is going to be kind of used a la like Marvin Williams from that North Carolina championship team where Marvin Williams went number 2 in the draft, but didn't start for that championship team. And I'm not saying Biddle is going to be the number 2 draft pick in the 2022 NBA draft, but I think it's going to be a case in which, hey, we're going to start Dante and Kepnog together. Biddle, you're going to come in for either of those guys, and you're going to still play 20, 25 minutes a game. You're still going to be on the court a lot. You probably will be on the court at the end of the game, but we want to go big to start, and then we want to bring you in and kind of as a change of pace, different look where all of a sudden we go high-low, really big, to now we've got 4 guys around the perimeter and 1 guy down low, and you can hit threes and you can, give you that kind of a, different look. I think Aaron Estrada is the other one that is the guy that probably makes the most sense to be pulled out of that starting lineup right now. And that's because, look, if we look at the guys that they're going after from a transfer perspective, that's who they're looking at guards. And, I think it's probably a reason why Terry left is because he's looking at it like, I'm not going to be starting based off the guys that they're going after from a grad transfer perspective. And so, or a regular transfer perspective. And so I look at this and think he's probably the one that comes off, and you can put Eric at the 2, or you can bring the transfer in at the 2, or you can bring the transfer in at the 3. But I think that's probably the most likely scenario. Now, if like Oregon all of a sudden gets like a perfect scenario, and let's just use the Pac-12 players that are in the portal, Timmy Allen and Matt Bradley, like if they were to come out and say, get both those guys and land both Utah senior Timmy Allen and Cal guard senior Matt Bradley, if that was the case, I think then the lineup becomes very similar to what we had last year at Oregon, where it's Richardson, Bradley, Eric Williams, Timmy Allen, and then one of Kepnog or Dante. And it's 6'11" with then 4 guys that are 6'5" or taller. I actually kind of look at it right now, though, like this roster, very similar to 2 years ago, Peyton's last year. You've got a really, really good point guard in Will Richardson. You've got another really good athlete on the wing in Eric Williams, who was very similar to what Chris Duarte was as a junior. And then you've got a promising young big man and N'Faly Dante, and now Frank Kepnog. And then you're trying to find some pieces to add to that. Some athletes at the power forward spot, some shooters at the guard spot, and you just kind of just fill in those small little gaps with some, big transfers, and then you go from there. So the pieces aren't exactly the same, but I think that kind of reminds me of kind of where Oregon's at right now. If that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's interesting and strange. I think those are kind of casually following probably are going like, oh, Oregon now is going to be a team that stylistically has is undersized and plays 5 kind of interchangeable parts together. And I just kind of, it's pretty clearly not going to be the case, at least in 21, 22. Maybe they'll have full, alterations going forward, but it's pretty clear this was kind of an aberration in terms of the way the roster shook out. And like, frankly, if Dante doesn't get hurt, there's probably a pretty good chance that you see a starting lineup that resembles what we're talking about now anyway this year with, 4, 6, 5, 6, 6 guys, whether it's Eric Williams or LJ Figueroa, one of them doesn't start and you've got Dante at center. So like, I just wanted to point that out, and I'm just kind of getting your thoughts on stylistically how you could see this team changing. Cause I do think the size they have is honestly, it's different than any size they've had even in the past, because I think back to the Boucher, Bell, and I'll throw Cavell Bigby Williams in there just because he was, I think, the third guy that kind of played from that group. Those guys were all, not all, but like especially Boucher and Bell were really bouncy, quick, versatile defensive guys. And I'm not saying Kepnong and Dante aren't, but I look at those guys as being more like traditional rim protectors and maybe not the switchability to guard different positions. Like Jordan Bell was such a freak in terms of his ability to like guard shooting guards and small forwards and perimeter players and at least stay in front of them. And then you have Boucher on the back end to block shots or vice versa. I think this year's even group of bigs, because I do think this is about as talented a front court Oregon's had in a minute.
From a recruiting standpoint, 100%.
Yeah, and then you have to, but I mean, you do have to say like when they had Bull and Lewis King and Kenny Wooten, that group's probably pretty comparable in terms of. But this group is like legitimately, you've got Biddle, who's a 5-star, and then both Dante and Kepnong were like borderline 5-stars, like what, like top 25, 40 recruits.
Dante was a 5-star, and so was Biddle.
Yeah, but Kepnong
is
like 36.
Yeah, he was like 36th, and so if you're looking at this from a pure like ranking standpoint, 3 of Oregon's 12 best all-time recruits are on their roster, and they're all big guys. Dante is the 4th highest player they've ever signed. Biddle is the 5th highest player they've ever signed. And then Frank Kepnog is the 12th player that they've ever signed. And if you want to keep going, I mean, it gets better. Like Wilt Richardson's 15th. And so, I mean, there's talent on this team. Isaac Johnson, he hasn't been on the team in 2 years because he's on his mission. He's still in the top 25.
23rd, yeah.
Yeah. So, like, Oregon's got a roster of 4 centers and power forwards on their team, and they're all in the top 23 of all-time commits in program history. So, like, talent from a high school on paper perspective is not going to be an issue for this team, and it's why I still believe, even though they've got these voids right now at shooting guard and backup guard, that they're going to be a top 25 in team preseason. And they're going to be one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the Pac-12. I think UCLA getting to the Final Four and most likely having all 5 starters back, I think that makes them kind of the overwhelming favorite. But it's not like UCLA is so far ahead of where Oregon's at from a talent perspective and from a coaching perspective that the gap is so wide. Like it's not going to surprise me one bit if Oregon 3-peats as Pac-12 champions next year. Like,
really quickly, Matt, like, because maybe this is a natural transition to start talking about the women, but I think the men and the women's college basketball, the Pac-12 is set up for some really fun seasons next
100%.
year. 100%. I mean, think about how both of those, in men's and women's basketball, how the conference, performed in the NCAA tournament. Obviously, I mean, the national championship game is 2 Pac-12 teams.
All Pac-12 team.
That's awesome. And Stanford is picked to be one of the top teams again. Arizona, I think people aren't sure on it yet, but you go look and see what's happened the last couple of days. They've had Sam Thomas, one of their starters, announced she'll come back. They just picked up a transfer from an all SEC caliber forward who's available right away. They bring a couple other players back. Like, they'll be really good. And in the Pac-12 on the men's side, and on the women's side, there's a bunch. I mean, we'll talk about Oregon in a minute here, but like on the men's side, like USC picked preseason. I've seen a couple of them second nationally. I mean, that seems a little high, but hey, they bring everybody back, and they were one of the best teams in the tournament. USC, I know they lose Evan Mobley and maybe Isaiah Mobley, but they're still going to be really talented. And then, what happens with Arizona? And then the wild card for me, along with Oregon, is Oregon State, is how many of those guys say they're coming back, and how interesting of a team could they have? And that doesn't even include other teams in this conference, which should have a lot of talent. You look at some of the recruits that are coming in. It should be a really exciting year. And my hope is that the fact that the Pac-12 performed so well in the tournament and outperformed expectations by such a high degree, that you go into this season with more respect on the names of these programs, and that is able to, pave the way for much better seeding going into the tournament. And that this year looks a little bit more, the 21-22 season looks a little bit more like the 2016-2017 season of the Pac-12, where you had not only Oregon make the Final Four, but you had UCLA, I think, was a 2 or a 3 seed. You had Arizona, I think, as a 2 or a 3 seed. You had 3 Pac-12 teams all in the top, 10 or 12 teams nationally going into that tournament. That's the kind of thing I go, like, I feel like the Pac-12 is destined to have a season like that, or could have a season like that. And I think that should get you pretty fired up thinking about this Oregon team, is that if the conference elevates itself like it did last tournament, that makes it a lot easier for Oregon, I think. And I think that's been something that's kind of, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, because I know we've been talking for a while and we do want to talk about women's basketball, but I think, you look at some of these seasons where the seed lines haven't been the most optimal, I guess, or the most complimentary. And part of that has been that the league just hasn't been that strong. And if UCLA can get back to where it's been, I know Arizona just in the last 24, 48 hours made a coaching change, fired Sean Miller. Honestly, about time that happened. But what's the fallout there? It just feels like the league is set up to be in a better place going into next season than it has been for a while. And I think that's something that should get you really enthusiastic if you're an Oregon fan specifically, because the Ducks have kind of owned the conference here for, they're on a mini conference dynasty the last half decade or so in terms of winning championships, playing deep into tournaments. But I think they've kind of been playing with a hand behind their back because the conference hasn't really gone with them at some points. And I think if they can get the UCLA's, Arizona, USC's, maybe even Washington may make a new coaching change at some point and figure itself out a little bit. I just think the upside of the conference feels like it's headed in the right direction right now.
Yeah, it's certainly going that way. And I mean, this offseason, this tournament run was huge for the league. But I think now, I think the 2021-2022 season from the men's perspective is probably one of the most important runs that we'll see in the league's history in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And it can't happen, and it can't be that important unless what happened in the tournament happened.
Right.
But now the league can't fall on its face next year. They need to go out. They need to win some non-conference games in November and December. And then they need to go out and they need to, again, put 4, 5, 6 teams into the tournament. And they need to have 4, 5, 6 teams win one game. 3 or 4 of those teams make it to the Sweet 16. 2 or 3 of those teams make it to the Elite Eight. And 1 or 2 of those teams make it to the Final Four. That would be huge for the league. And then at that point, it not only does it verify that this run was legit, it pushes the needle even more, where going into that 2022-2023 season, they're full on respect. And I think to transition it at a point where the women's league is at. We discussed this on a podcast before the tournament, how we just didn't think the women were very good. And then as the tournament started playing out on the women's side, it was kind of oh boy, maybe Oregon is actually pretty darn good. It's just the league is stacked and it's so far better than every other league in the conference. We were, kind of tunnel visioned and focused on what we were seeing in front of us and not comparing it around the country, that Oregon was actually in a good spot. They were just, while they weren't maybe playing as good as they possibly could have, they were still better than a lot of other teams out there.
Yeah, no, I think the strength of the Pac-12 women's basketball became very, very clear. And I will say, here's what I'll say, and I know we want to talk about the upcoming team, but it did make me feel, we haven't recorded since Stanford beat Arizona for the championship on Sunday. By the way, fantastic game, great Final Four games. Like all three of those games came down to like the last couple of minutes and were really, really fun. You know, the Final Four games and then the national championship. I watched all of them. And for those of you who missed out, it was a fantastic women's tournament. It was a great men's tournament. Obviously, I'm a Gonzaga fan, went to school there. That was a bit of a gut punch the way that tournament ended, but the women's tournament was just constantly fun. And I think, you know, I couldn't help but think back to that Oregon team the year before. And I know we all everybody's felt that Oregon with Sabrina Ionescu, Ruthie Hebert, Satu Sabali would have won in 2020, that NCAA tournament. And I couldn't help but feel even stronger in my sense of that, because we watched a Stanford team who, honestly, I think that Oregon team a year ago beats by 20, 25 points. I mean, if I'm being objective, that was basically the same Stanford team Oregon faced last year, and Oregon beat them by about that margin several times. And I know Stanford, I think, might have gotten one on them later on in the year or whatnot, but that was a team Oregon was much better than. Same thing with that Arizona team. And I know those teams are slightly different and whatnot, but the fact that those teams went out and beat UConn and South Carolina that year, or, you know, in the NCAA tournament this year, and the caliber of that team with Sabrina, I just couldn't help watching that kind of feel like, it hurt a little bit more watching the Pac-12 win, even though it's awesome for the league. First conference championship first national championship the conference has had in like almost 30 years. But I couldn't help but watch. I'm sure those listening who followed women's basketball in this Oregon program in particular couldn't help but feel a little bit of like, oh man, Stanford gets to do it the next year after Oregon had quite clearly a dominant team that was honestly like a full step above Stanford. I'm not trying to diminish the Stanford team, but like legitimately, you put Oregon's team with, you know, that 2019-20 team and you've matched up against this Stanford team. And I take Oregon's team probably 9 out of 10 times, and probably 6 of them, it's like a 20-point game. And that's where it gets frustrating, because you're like, they should have been the reigning national champions, and they weren't. And I know this is a conversation we've had a lot before, but I think it just needs to be said after watching the NCAA tournament and how fun that was to see the Pac-12 finally win one, but also kind of recognize Oregon just missed on such a great chance the year before.
Okay, let's look at these transfers from the women's perspective and just look at the program as a whole right now. Both Jazz Shelley and Taylor Chavez, they're probably the most experienced players on this team, going into the year for sure. And then, even though that they weren't starters full time this past season, they still had the most experience. I mean, they both were members of the team that you were just speaking of, that we're going to probably win the national championship before COVID shut things down. Taylor Chavez was a member of the Final Four team. They were the last connections, if you will, to this program, to the rotation in the core unit of Sabrina and Ruthie and Satu. And so it's kind of a changing of a guard now. Like every other player on this roster, they did not play in games with anyone on that Final Four team.
Isn't that crazy? I was thinking about the other day. It's crazy that we're like not even, we're like 15 months, 14 months removed from that team playing, and no one's standing. No one is left standing now. That's
and
crazy.
So, like, were you surprised though that they departed? Like,
no, not really, not really. I mean, not to say that like I couldn't have seen either coming back, but the way that these seasons played out. Well, here's a thought that just to start with, and those who maybe didn't follow the team quite as closely. Jazz Shelley was supposedly out with an injury in the NCAA tournament, and yet she plays the last 5 minutes against Louisville. And I'm not doubting she had some sort of injury, but like I think it was pretty clear at that point in the year the injury might not have been. It was an injury that she could clearly play through a little bit, and clearly I think she had an idea that her career was possibly over at that point. So she comes in and plays 5 minutes against Louisville in the Sweet 16, even though she's been ruled out, quote unquote, by Kelly Graves going into it. And so like I when that happened, I was like, that was pretty notable. Like that's kind of a curtain call for her of like, hey, this is my last time at Oregon. But just, and that's just kind of an aside kind of thing I'd thought of and noticed at the time. Like, it's kind of strange that Kelly is saying, and he's been very upfront and honest with injuries, that she's dealing with an injury that's going to keep her out for the tournament, and yet here she is playing even when the game gets out of hand. She comes into the game and she's been dressed the whole time. Like that was always kind of strange to me. But anyway, But yeah, just in terms of like kind of just their seasons, these were two players who in supplementary offensive roles, defensive roles, what have you, were really impactful in 2019-20. Two of the conference's better three-point shooters. Chavez led the conference the year before, shot almost 50% from three. Shelley shot 42%. And I think just kind of the fact of the matter is when they were asked to carry a little bit larger role, they didn't handle it very well. And both of them saw their shooting numbers drop drastically. You know, Chavez about 15 percentage points on threes, Shelley about 12. Their scoring, both of them averaged about 6.5 points the year before, both down to about 4. Their minutes stayed pretty similar. Both of their turnover numbers, Shelley in particular, skyrocketed or at least went up in terms of like the by minute numbers. So like all those things kind of considered, and just the up and down nature of the season, the fact that in the NCAA tournament, neither of them were really playing, and the fact that those who were playing were freshmen. I think it was kind of clear that at least one of them was going to leave, and I wasn't surprised really to see them both leave in fairly short order. I think these are two players that, like, you know, Oregon's had some players transfer out of the program the last couple of years, as you expect with men's and women's basketball, especially an elite program. These are two players who I think will do well wherever they go. I think Chavez is clearly somebody who, if you can have her in a kind of a supplementary role, she can handle it, but she's not ever going to be a primary ball handler or a primary scorer at this level. And I think Shelley's probably kind of the same thing. I think both of them are not point guards. And I think, unfortunately, they were kind of both trying to be cast in that role a little bit this last year, just because of, you know, missing pieces. I mean, the reality is Tina Paopao was the only point guard this season until Kelly Graves decided Maddie Shear was capable of playing that role. And once she kind of established herself there really wasn't any opportunity for these other two to play very much. And I think ultimately that was what was facing both of them going into next season, was the reality that you kind of saw the future and the writing on the wall there of they played Maddie Shear a ton of minutes. Tina Paopao, I think, led the team in minutes per game. Those two were going to dominate the minutes going into next season. And then you've got Sydney Parrish and Taylor Mikesell, who both played a lot this year. Taylor Mikesell played it probably, I don't know, second or third on the team in minutes this past season. I don't know. Her minutes aren't going to completely go away. And then you've got Sydney Parrish and you've got Taylor Bigby. And I just think it was pretty clear by the end of the season that these two were kind of bottom of the totem pole for guard minutes. And I don't expect that was going to change. In fact, my feeling was that Kelly Graves had sort of recognized by the end of conference play going into postseason play that they needed to have the rotation cut, especially in the backcourt. And I think we saw that transition take place. And I would anticipate that was sort of what the conversations looked like going into next season, that they were like, hey, the reality is we're gonna play these younger players more, and you can stick around. We've got scholarships for you, but your role is going to be less than it was even this year. And I mean, you can play. Maybe you stick around and you fight for it, and you beat. You know, and you actually changed our minds. But based upon what we saw this last year, this is where we're at. And so those are the conversations I think happened behind closed doors, and I think ultimately probably best for both of them to leave. And again, it is. Matt made a good point there, and I hadn't. You know, you kind of totally. I guess I hadn't totally set in that. Yeah, there are no remaining pieces on this roster from that great era of basketball. And that might not be a terrible thing too, in terms of moving on from that. I do feel like there was kind of a bit of a hangover effect from the previous seasons. I'm not saying that these two presences on the team impact that negatively, but like, it's maybe not a terrible thing to just not have anybody still kind of stuck up on that. And everybody's kind of now focused on being that next great group. So I think it's a bummer to see them both transfer. I think two very likable young women, two players who gave it all for Oregon, and certainly no one questions their effort, but I think ultimately this can be a win for both. I think a win for Oregon in terms of freeing up more playing time for some of its younger guards, who I think by the end of the season clearly had kind of passed them up, and I think benefit for both of these two to get a new fresh start and head somewhere else. And I think probably both of them will have really successful careers in whatever capacity and whatever school that next stop's at.
It's kind of, is it fair to say that this is a growth of the program, and that those two players, while they had their moments, they maybe didn't progress as quickly as needed to continue to have their roles? And as Oregon continues to elevate its program, they're recruiting at a higher and higher level every year, and just younger players came in they've quickly caught up to the level that they're at, or surpassed them, and they weren't going to play. Like, is that fair to say? Just the natural evolution of a program where better players are now in the program, and it's tougher to keep your job.
Yeah, no, I actually, what I think of is a conversation. I can't remember if we had this off podcast or on podcast, but we had about kind of Casey Benson and the Peyton Pritchard scenario from a while ago, where Benson was really capable, right? I mean, he had some great moments at Oregon.
He led the country in assist turnover as a starter as a sophomore.
Right. I mean, those kind of accomplishments are great. And, neither Chavez or Shelley quite had a starting reputation, but both like sort of similar in terms of they were very supplementary parts. They weren't going to be players that dominated the game, but they could certainly impact winning. But I know, and the conversation I remember we had was, Peyton Pritchard was just like a better player than Casey Benson. And the reality is if Casey Benson was in the same recruiting class as Peyton Pritchard, they would have chosen Peyton Pritchard probably, and Benson wouldn't even be on the team. And I'm not saying that either Chavez or Shelley aren't capable of playing at a school like Oregon, but I also think with the way Oregon's recruiting and the caliber of landing now suddenly 5-star recruits, which they did during that period of time, but neither Shelley or Chavez are 5 stars. They're, Shelley's international, so the ranking's not quite congruent. And you've got Chavez, who was, I think, Miss Basketball in the state of Arizona, but, like top 50 recruit, which is really good, but not quite the same level as the other players. And I think the reality is if these players are in the 2021 recruiting class and Oregon has to pick from Taylor Chavez, Jazz Shelley, or Maddie Shear and Dina Paopao, I think it's pretty clear who they're picking. And so Oregon has elevated itself from a recruiting perspective. The standard's different. The caliber of player they bring in is a little different. And I think by season's end, it was pretty clear that the true freshmen, the 18, 19-year-old girls on the team, were a little better than these sophomores and juniors who are a couple of years older. And that's not necessarily a huge fault to them, but I think indicative of the fact that the program has elevated itself. And those two players who, again, had some great moments the last couple of years. And there's no question about it. I think Chavez was really big at times in 2019-20. Shelley had some huge games hitting 3-point shots and playing quality defense. But they found players that were a little better and a little bit more capable that happened to be younger. And again, I think it's best probably for all parties that this is kind of the final outcome of this. And it allows Kelly Graves to kind of focus his attention and his minutes on some of these players who we saw sort of excelling late in the season, and allows those two to go somewhere else where they can probably, get a starting job more than likely, I would think, depending upon where they go. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Taylor Chavez transfer to Arizona or Arizona State or somewhere back in her home state and be a little bit of a thorn in Oregon's side. And who knows where Jazz ends up. But this is just kind of, I'm not reporting it, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them end up in the conference or in other high conferences. I don't think they're going to transfer down a huge amount and play at a much smaller level. I think they've proven capable of playing at this level. I mean, I think Chavez was the Pac-12 Sixth Player of the Year a couple of years ago. It's pretty clear she could do that. But Oregon clearly not the right fit with the way their program is going.
I look at this and now wonder, okay, let's transition to off-season additions. I'm a big belief, and I don't know if we've said this on the show, that I think from the women's side, they had too many players this past season, and it was tough to kind of play everybody, keep everybody happy, and at the same time develop talent. And so my question is, we look at this team now without Chavez and Shelley, and at the guard spots, they have Taylor Mikesell, they have Tahina Paopao, Maddie Shear, and then Sydney Parrish. They've got one recruit coming in. Do they go out and they've got 2 scholarships available, or do they have more? First of all, is there more than just 2 available?
Yeah, they have 4 because in women's you get 15 instead
That's
of
right.
13.
So they have 4 scholarships to use. Should they and will they go out and hit the transfer market? I don't know if they should or not, unless they're saying, to, in my opinion, hey, one of these other returning guards isn't up to snuff yet, and we're going to go out and find someone to take their minutes.
Yeah, so a couple things here. First off, I don't expect them to lose any other transfers. That's just kind of my sense, and a couple things I've been told. I think this is what they're losing, so keep that in mind. 11's a perfectly good size roster, by the way, for college basketball. On the women's side, it's not a bad number. I mean, you see teams play with less. You've seen Oregon teams in the past that are really good play with 9 or 10 scholarship players that are healthy. Oregon can win with 11. So like, I don't think it's the end of the world if they don't add another player. I think at most you're going to see them add one. I don't think they're going to add a prep. You look through kind of who's available still in the 2021 class. There's just not enough. There's just not a capable enough player unless something happens, and you could see somebody get out of a scholarship. Maybe there's a coaching change, et cetera. But like, I think at this point you can kind of cross that possibility off of them going and adding another high school player. I do think they will kick the tires on some transfers. I think they would like to have probably another guard that can get the ball to the rim, a guard that can kind of handle the ball. Because I think that so like you probably wouldn't mind adding another guard just because you've seen your numbers dip from 7 to 5. Not that 5 is like a terrible number. Matt said earlier, I think 5 on the men's side he thinks is a pretty good number for scholarships in terms of carrying that number. You get to 6, it's probably not a terrible thing. But I think you got to be very careful with what you try to bring in here because you don't. I think the thing that was pretty clear between Shelley and Chavez, they were pretty similar in their strengths and in their weaknesses. Both could shoot the ball pretty well from 3. Neither did very well this season, but like they were capable there. Neither of them were really creators. Neither of them could really get the ball to the rim and score or get the ball to the rim and set somebody else up. Shelley was probably a little bit more apt in doing that than Chavez. Chavez basically was catch and shoot, could bring the ball up and maybe pass it, but not somebody who really ever initiated offense off her own dribble in terms of like creating anything. So like, I think it was pretty clear that Oregon would have been better off with even like a Mignon Moore type at that spot. Somebody who's good defensively, but who can also kind of set players up. Because I actually think you look at Shelley Chavez and then Taylor Mikesell, and you go, those 3 players are all pretty similar. They are average to not good defensively, and they are really good upside 3-point shooters, but they don't really provide much else. None of those players, I should say, are getting to the rim and scoring frequently. That's just not kind of their style. So I think Oregon, if they are going to add somebody, I think they would use a scholarship on finding maybe an older guard who can get to the rim and who can set people up. But I think the other caveat here is they want to make sure they get their young players minutes because this past season they took that away. And so they aren't going to – I think you want to add somebody unless it's like a superstar who's out there. And I'm not really aware of anybody that fits that profile currently on the market. And that doesn't mean someone can't become available. The Final Four, the national championship just happened. There's certainly time. I mean, Oregon just had 2 players transfer on Wednesday. What's to say that you can't have a couple more players across the country transfer, someone that's enticing? But like, I think you also have to bring in somebody who understands that their role might be 8 to 12 minutes off the bench, and maybe that 8 to 12 becomes 16 to 20 if they play really well. But like that, there's the minutes here are going to be going to Tahina Paopao and Maddie Shear and to Sydney Parrish and to Taylor Mikesell and maybe some to Taylor Bigby. That's where the minutes are going to be headed. And I don't think you want to add somebody just to add somebody, and you certainly don't want to add somebody who's going to come in expecting to play starters minutes, and that takes away from some of these other players, unless that player is just a like full-on superstar top-tier talent, which again I'm not aware of right now. So yeah, I think maybe they take one, but it has to be the right fit.
It really feels like for both the men and the women that for one of these spots, like if they were going to fill it, it would be for a player who would come in and redshirt, and that's just not feasible this year because of COVID, everyone gets a free year,
exactly.
And players aren't going to want to do that.
Yeah,
and they just carry it over. Because I think ideally Kelly probably would be in the same boat as Dana of, hey, let's go find someone that's got 3 or 4 years of eligibility. They're okay with redshirting, and we'll space out the classes a little bit, and this is a person that we can really develop. And I just don't think that's something that's legitimate in this year's world of basketball because everyone gets a free year and they're eligible right away.
Yeah. And I think the reality is that more than likely you're going to see quite a few departures after the 21-22 season. Taylor Mikesell in theory could have another year because of the NCAA rule, but she might just decide to go. I would also point to Niara Sabally and Sedona Prince as being two players who will probably at least consider completing their collegiate careers after next season. Both of them have remaining eligibility for sure, but both of them also have been through a lot and have been on college basketball teams for a lot longer than their actual playing experience shows. And so then they both have legitimate WNBA aspirations if they have as good a seasons as we expect. So I think really you could see Oregon stand pat here and then really try to build towards the 2022 season, 2022-23 season in that class. And I don't think they're going to take a huge number, but prioritizing taking 3 to 4 high-end players, maybe a grad transfer there. And that might be a spot where you could see them, finding a player that fits the profile I was talking about a second ago, kind of a lead guard who can handle the ball, get the ball to the rim, push the tempo a little bit. There's certainly some prospects they're in 2022 that there'll be more there'll be more content on the ducktarter.com for VIP subscribers on some of those kind of names in the upcoming week or so. But I could see that being where they go, where they just kind of stand pat in the transfer portal, don't take any preps going, don't make any further additions, I guess, for the 21-22 roster. And then 22-23 is a year where they're building towards adding a couple more players and again, probably some sort of primary combo or just legitimate point guard.
What's like, I think from the men's perspective, Oregon is going to be a team that's going to compete for a championship. The women's side is, I think, way more cutthroat right now. Like, there are so many good teams.
Yeah.
Is Oregon in that mix where it's, hey, you guys are going to be a top 2 or 3 team in the league, or are they going to be more of the 5 or the 6 range? How do you view, as this roster constructed, the teams that are coming back with talent, the teams that have to reload? Is it safe to say, though, that even after Chavez and Shelley's departures, this is still a championship caliber team?
I think so. And I think it's a little early to know exactly where everything settles for like the league hierarchy. I will say like ESPN did its way too early top 25. And I know sometimes those matter, sometimes they don't. And Oregon was the 2nd rated team in the conference, 10th nationally. Stanford was picked third, which I thought was interesting because they returned most of their team, and won the national championship like 4 days ago, but yet they're not the number 1 team going into the offseason. But I think that's kind of a mistake. But either way, like Oregon is 10th, Oregon State was 15th, and there were no other Pac-12 teams. UCLA and Arizona lose their top players, and quite a bit along with that. Like I said, Arizona, since the publication of that story, has seen Sam Thomas, arguably it's like 3rd best player from last year's team, come back and then added a quality transfer. So like they probably are going to be a little better than what people, than what the ESPN, at least initial prognosis suggests. But I legit think that the conference is shifting a little bit again, and it happens all the time, every couple of years. I think Stanford is pretty clearly going to be the best team in the conference. They return almost everybody, and they just won a national championship. So to expect Oregon to be better than them is probably asking too much. But I also don't think it's like legit. I don't think it's like really, crazy to think like this team could be the 2nd best team in the Pac-12 and challenge Stanford in their games. And maybe be a top 3, top 4 seed in the NCAA tournament, or even maybe better in best case scenario. But like, I think for that to happen, you're really going to have to see Sedona Prince and Tahina Paopao, and I'll throw Niara Sabally in there as well. Although like, I don't know exactly what the growth looks like from her, but like those 3 players have to just be money and get even better. And I think Sedona in particular, you saw the flashes at the end of the season, especially against Georgia, of like, she can completely change a game. And you need to see that over the course of a full season. And Tahina Paopao needs to be healthy for a full season. And I think Niara Sabally certainly has some areas she can improve on. But like, if those 3 players can be all a better version, and I think they all should be in theory, because they all should be healthier, have a full off season. This is all of their first years of playing college basketball. But if those 3 players all take a step and go from being like, all conference caliber to being, in conversation for All-American, and maybe one or both, or one or a couple of them are legitimate like conference player of the year sort of candidates, or at least in the discussion, then they can take a big step. But I think it'll come to how far this team can go and what the ceiling is going to be dependent on those 3 players. And then probably supplementary, like, can they get the 3-point shooting to improve again? Because this is a team that was shooting like legitimately in the 40% as a team for 5-6 years straight. One of the best 3-point shooting teams every year. So last year they just weren't very good. And there are players on this team who we think are good shooters who just weren't good shooters last year. And Taylor Chavez and Jazz Taylor were two of those players we thought were going to shoot better than they did, and they didn't. And now they're gone. And can Taylor Mike still shoot it at a better level? What about Sidney Parrish? And what about even like a Maddie Shear, who didn't take a lot of threes, but needs to take a step there. So like, I think there's a lot of pieces that need to kind of sort out. Like, this isn't a team that's like ready made and you feel confident. Like, you're going to need for this team to be really good. They need to take strides, which obviously, like we've seen with Oregon teams in the past, that wasn't the case. Like that 2019-20 team, we knew going into that season, they were like ready for it. They were built for it. We had already seen it the previous couple of years that they had the kind of the strength and the willpower and the competitive fight and the experience playing in big games. This year's team needs to kind of, I think, sort through some of that. But like, I wouldn't be like stunned that if we go into, a year from now and we head into the NCAA tournament, that they're, a 2 or 3 seed and a team that we legitimately think can compete for a title. Winning a title is going to be really tough. Stanford brings everybody back. UConn brings everybody back and adds some players. South Carolina does something similar. The top tier talent in women's college basketball is going to be an absolute, it's going to be really tough. So maybe they can contend for a Final Four spot, but boy, getting a championship with the way things are set up right now, it was going to be tough. Like I think this year, like, so 2019-20 were some really good teams. Obviously Oregon, I think, had the best one. 2020-21, I think, was a bit of a dip down. 21-22 should be a step back up because all the top programs basically return all their top players and then add some really, really good recruits. Like, Paige Becker's set all these awards and all these records and National Player of the Year as a freshman. People are saying that they just signed the number 1 player in Azzi Fudd, who's one of Paige's best friends, and people suggest that she might be as good, if not better, than Becker's. So like, UConn's got that backcourt going, and it's like, so just like winning a championship is going to be really tough. But like, I think they can. I legit think top 10 doesn't feel ridiculous, and I honestly think the ceiling's probably a little higher.
And obviously, I think the style is going to be, when we talked about this, I think when the season ended for them. Yeah. But the style is going to be different too from what we typically think of, right? Like, I think of the past era, I'm going to call it the last era, with Sabrina and Ruthie and Satu. It was 1 in, 4 out, a ton of fast pace up and down, free flowing, spread, super spread out, when it's in the half court. And it feels like it's going to be the opposite of that. Like, they'll run if it's there, but they probably want to, right? Like, the way the roster is constructed, play a half-court game and just abuse teams down low.
That's what I would do. When Oregon had its success at the end of the season, it went double big, and it had Sabally and Prince playing kind of high-low basketball. And part of that was you don't have Tina Paopao to run some of the offense, and I think both of those are – Sedona in particular can really set up players with the ball at the top of the key. I would imagine that is where you want your bread and butter right there, those two. And you get one of them at the elbow, one of them at the block, and you just kind of let them play one-on-one basketball, somebody at their back, and set it up. And if it's not there, you have cutters coming off of them, sort of thing, and find easy looks at the basket. And there's a reason that Kelly Graves at one point compared Sedona Prince to Nikola Jokic, the NBA center who just, I don't know, he doesn't lead the league in assists right now, but I think he averages like 8. That kind of a player. I don't know if she was ever going to be quite as productive in terms of setting teammates up, but like, certainly she has that potential. So like, I think